Now, the cost of living crisis continues to bite for everyday New Zealanders. Food prices have hit a record high, mortgage rates are on the rise, and inflation this week predicted to hit the highest in over 30 years. For more on this, Deputy Prime Minister Grant Robertson. And Minister, we will get to inflation very shortly, but I just want to talk to you first this morning about Kevin O'Sullivan, who is the New Zealand Cruise Association CEO. He joined us this morning to say he faces embarrassment this week heading over to the International Cruise Conference in Miami, and the rest of the world has opened up, but he has no information on when our maritime border is going to open, despite believing that there has already been a decision made. Is there any reason we can't save him and New Zealand from that embarrassment?
Well, good morning, Melissa. There hasn't been a decision made. The government's been working through how we can safely open our maritime border. As you'll be aware, we've always taken the advice of our public health officials. It's served New Zealand pretty well. We're still waiting on some of that advice from our health officials. We're very well aware that, particularly for New Zealand, the cruise season is the summer season, so we do want to give people plenty of notice, and we expect to be able to say something in the next few weeks. But, you know, we've tried to work really hard on behalf of New Zealand businesses and workers and households to make sure we do the right thing from a health perspective and an economic perspective, and we're not far away from being able to make that decision and give that advice through to Kevin and those who are affected by it.
A few weeks, maybe a few weeks too late, it could potentially lose us millions. Pre-pandemic, $565 million worth of spending was attributed to the cruise industry in the year to June 2019. For the sake of making a decision now so that he can go to that cruise conference, why can't we just decide? The borders are opening to visa waiver tourists from May the 1st.
Yeah, and look, obviously, you know, different types of tourism have different impacts, and we're all aware of the impact that those cruise ships had in the early stages of the pandemic. They were places where COVID-19 spread quickly and caused us some issues even at the beginning, if you recall. So we will step through this carefully. We've always made sure we put New Zealanders' health and safety as our first and most paramount thing, but we recognise that there are economic impacts here. We're awaiting some final advice from our health officials, and we'll just announce it as soon as we can. As you note, we do have people coming in across the air border. We've got Australians here, got people from visa waiver countries coming shortly. But equally, this is mainly a summer-based industry, and so we'll make sure that there's plenty of time for people to be able to know what's happening in terms of that.
Aren't those cruise ships effectively floating MIQ hotels, though? You could have people on there and they have to test before they can leave. I mean, if anything, we know that we can test people and get them into the economy safely now.
And look, that may well be a part of what occurs when tourist ships come back into New Zealand. As you say, we've got the testing now with rapid antigen tests that enable us to move pretty quickly, and that may well be part of what we do. Is the decision currently not being made because the Prime Minister is visiting Asia instead? No, that's not the case. We've got a cabinet meeting today. We're getting on with the business of what we're doing. No, the reason is that we're awaiting some further advice from health officials. As soon as we get that, we'll be in a position to make a decision and announce it. Okay, so the decision can be made still while the Prime Minister is away? For sure, yep. We have, as I say, we have a cabinet meeting today where a number of decisions will be made, but we are still awaiting that specific advice on cruise ships. Okay, let's go to inflation, because economists are predicting that it will rise above 7% later this week, which is the highest it's been in about 30 years. We had Cameron Bagri on this morning saying, look, one way to curb that is to cut back on government spending. There's a budget in exactly a month. Have you looked at cutting back on that spending given the developments in terms of the inflation rate? Yeah, look, we always try to strike a careful balance with our spending, but we're not going to lower the price of food by cutting health spending. You know, and a big part of this budget will be how we set ourselves up for a new health system that's going to deliver to people wherever they live in New Zealand. Over the course of the last couple of years, we have invested significantly to support New Zealanders. That's, you know, the money we spent was on the wage subsidy scheme and the resurgent support payment and all these ways that we've protected and supported New Zealand households and businesses. I think New Zealanders have appreciated that. Our spending is now much more targeted when it comes to COVID, and we will be careful about that. But the other side of the coin is we still need to invest in our health system, our education system, to build housing. We've got to keep doing that. We'll strike a balance. On the other side of the ledger, the Reserve Bank, their job is to control inflation, and obviously they're making their moves in that regard.
Okay, so when you say you're going to strike a balance, does that mean that extra $6 billion in spending might not actually be fully spent? Are you pulling back on that now?
Well, as I say, a big chunk of that is a one-off increase for health spending, and people will be aware that we're getting rid of the district health boards, we're resetting the clock for our health system, we're investing significantly in areas where there have been big inequities such as for Māori. This is an area where we've got to be able to invest now to make sure that system gets off on the right foot. That's a one-off. In future years, the level of new operating allowances is much more back where we've been in the last few years. So I think New Zealanders understand there's a balance to be had here. You cut your nose off to spite your face if you decide to not build any more state houses for a few years, because that just makes housing problems worse. So we understand the importance of striking a balance, but we won't attack the issues where inflation is the worst by not spending on health. Where it's the worst is in areas like fuel, and fuel influences everything, including the prices that you pay at the supermarket. It's the supply chain constraints on building supplies. All around the world, Melissa, you're seeing inflation up at these levels, 7% in the UK, 8%
Indeed,
in
although
the US.
Australia's rate is only half of New Zealand's inflation. So it can't fully be imported if that situation is there in comparison to New Zealand's 7% we're expecting this week.
Well, different economies have different drivers. In Australia, they have a lot more of their own energy that they produce. They're a net exporter of energy, so that gives them a slightly different basis to be moving from. They're at a slightly different stage of the pandemic, but equally their inflation numbers come out next week and are also projected to be up around those record levels. This is a global issue. We have to work hard in New Zealand to make sure that we manage that. The Reserve Bank have the job of keeping inflation down, but we will also always take a careful and balanced approach when it comes to our spending.
And I think on spending, people recognise that they are being asked to curb their own spending, but I think what people are also looking to see is that the government budget spending is curbed so that everybody is, I guess, in the same boat. There's a couple that we heard about here on AM last week who have a mortgage of $550,000. They have rates that were 2.29% that have now risen to 5.25%. So they're paying an extra $920 a month. That's $11,000 a year. What do you say to this couple? Is this a government that's going to put more money back into their pocket, or are you saying you have to suck it up because of the inflation at the moment?
Well, as I say, inflation is a global phenomenon, and clearly rates of inflation are projected not only to be at the record levels you're talking about for this quarter, but now economists are saying perhaps into the second quarter of the year, and then starting to come down from there. I think those people would also want the government to keep making sure that we do spend on health and education, and we do the right things by making sure the public services are available for them, but it is a careful balance. Any spending that the government does, we have to take into account. So tax cuts are effectively, potentially inflationary as well, especially if they're very untargeted. So this is the challenge we've got. It's the particular part of the economic cycle that we're in. New Zealand's done well. We're well positioned. We've got low unemployment. We've had good growth. This is a difficult period, but we will come through the other side of it.
Just want to touch on the Prime Minister's trip to Asia at the moment, visiting Singapore and Japan. China, of course, is our largest trading partner. Are our relations with China strained?
Well, our relations with China are good, and obviously New Zealand continues to export a lot of goods into China and has done right through the pandemic. China is taking a different approach to COVID than most other countries at the moment, and so therefore isn't taking the kinds of delegations that the Prime Minister is currently leading in Japan and Singapore. From time to time we're going to have areas where we do disagree with China, and we've talked about that openly. We've raised those issues with them, but that doesn't mean that the relationship overall is in trouble or anything like that. But in terms of visits, they're just not having the kinds of delegations that the PM's leading to Japan and Singapore, where we've got business people and...
Sorry, do those issues impact our desire to our dependence on China and our reliance on them for trade? Or are we trying to move ourselves offshore to Singapore and Japan, our fourth and fifth largest trading partners?
I think diversification in both where we sell our products to and the kinds of products we sell is absolutely essential. And I think that's one of the things that COVID has taught us, that you can't afford as a country to have all your eggs in one basket. So China will remain important, but equally we've got to be pushing those markets where we already have a foothold, like Singapore and Japan, but also the United States and up into Europe, South America. These are all places where New Zealand has the potential to be able to sell our goods and services into. And so, yep, we're definitely looking for a diversification strategy. It's an important part of our overall economic plan.
Deputy Prime Minister Grant Robertson, thanks very much for your time this morning.